G'day chemistry students. In this video we're going to be steering away a little bit from some of the heavy math that comes with this module, taking a little bit of a break looking at dot point 6.3.5. It's all about acid-base techniques that we might see in industry or everyday life, some applications of where you may see acids and bases being used for our own benefit. Let's get into it. Now, the most common acid-base reaction that we have and use and see the most would be neutralization. And there's a technique that we can use called titration, which really takes advantage of that particular reaction. We can combine an acid and a base together to be able to determine the concentration of an acid or base we don't know the concentration of already. Now, that is something that we're going to be focusing on in the coming weeks. But it's a technique that, while we don't see it happening all the time necessarily, has a big impact on our everyday lives in lots and lots of different ways. And that's something that I want to be exploring today. So we can do acid-base titration to find the concentrations, again, of a variety of different acids and bases in a bunch of different contexts. pH can be really, really, really important to monitor and manage, both from an industry perspective as well as from an environmental perspective as well. As such, we're always monitoring water for its pH. And that might be to see what the pH of our wastewater is, what rain source pH might be, other water sources we might be monitoring its pH as well. And that may have an impact on something like ecosystems or our own water supply. As well, pH can be monitored in things like aquariums to ensure that life can be supported in those tanks. However, we can take this further and start looking at industry, in particular food and beverage industry, where the pH levels of things that we eat and consume need to be monitored and managed, either because pH changes may be required during the manufacturing process, but also pH might need to be monitored and adjusted so that those food and beverages are able to be sold and safely consumed by people who purchase those goods. So, for example, pH levels get monitored a lot in the wine industry. There are some acids that can have an impact on the quality and taste of the wine. They need to be monitored quite closely. In the cheese making industry, there are a bunch of steps where pH control is really, really, really important to ensure the production of a quality product. And then there are a variety of quality checks for most foods, really, to ensure that they are safe to consume and are of a suitable quality. Acid-base titration can also be used to measure certain nutrients and their content within foods and beverages as well. Within the automotive industry, if we're looking at producing biodiesel, there actually has to be a pH adjusting step. So we can take the biodiesel sample, do some acid-base titration to figure out what the pH of the sample is, and then from there adjust it accordingly so that that biodiesel can be used in vehicles. We can also be doing some quality checks for cosmetics and paint as well. Here are some of the technologies that get used to undertake acid-base titration. A lot of the time we use colored pH indicators. This indicator is really important in determining what we call the equivalence point. That's something that we're going to be covering in significantly more detail in the coming weeks. But those indicators can help us complete a titration using a setup that's quite similar to this. The acid and the base will be in our burette here and our conical flask. They get combined until we hit a point of complete neutralization. Essentially, we're looking for a point where no more acid or base is present. Essentially, they've consumed each other. At that point, that's when we see our indicator change color. When we see that color change, then we can do a bunch of calculations to figure out the concentration of the substance that we don't know the concentration of. We don't have to use pH indicators. We can also use something like a pH probe, and there are technologies which can actually automatically conduct acid-base titration without the need for human operation of titration equipment. So we've just looked at some modern applications of acids and bases, but the use of acids and bases in societies predate modern chemistry. In particular, we can start looking at how acids and bases were used by Australia's First Nations peoples. As we usually highlight when looking at Aboriginal science, we see that the focus is on understanding the properties of substances which exist or can be made from materials of the land. Once you know what the properties of those substances are, Aboriginal people are then able to come up with ways to use them, use materials, use the land to their advantage. That's no different when we're looking at natural acids and bases which can be found on the land. Once we understand these properties, we use them for beneficial purposes. And in particular, something like a soap tree may have leaves, seeds, pods, which can be crushed and mixed with water, creating a lather, and literally can be used as a way of cleaning, forming essentially a soap. These soaps are usually quite basic and has been and still is an application of the land, an application of bases to suit particular purposes. Acids and bases can also be used from different kinds of plants to treat stings. Some stings are acidic from some particular insects, other stings are basic. Either way you look at it, some acidic trees can be used to neutralize basic stings. Some basic trees or plants can be used to neutralize acidic stings. Bases have also been used to be able to neutralize stomach acid and relieve symptoms of stomach aches. Thank you very much, everyone. In the next video, we're going to be looking at dissociation in a little bit more detail, in particular for weak acids and bases. Start to really look into how those processes are an equilibrium process and look at dissociation constants, Ka and Kb. Now, this is something that we introduced very briefly in Module 5. We're going to look at that in considerably more detail now in the coming video. But until then, have a good one.